I stared at the heavy iron door of the penthouse through blurred, tear-stricken eyes, my lungs burning with the kind of desperation only sheer terror can give you. June
I
Suk,
know, but
I'm
I can't
gone.
turn back now.
I didn't say it
Just
aloud.
hold on, I'm
I
almost
didn't
there.
have to. I just ran. Past the silent guards, past the curated luxury that now felt like a possessive cage, and into the rain-slicked streets of Seoul. I hit the lock on my burner phone with a triumphant, shaking jab of my thumb, feeling like I had finally escaped the underworld's reach. 6 weeks of hiding in shadows, 6 weeks of watching the news, waiting for a calculated search to crash through my door. I had spent 6 years building a career in business only to have it dismantled by one heated night of charged intimacy. I passed out on a thin mattress in a coastal town, still wearing the coat I'd fled in, feeling safe for the first time in months. But when morning came, the sunlight stabbing through the curtains of my cramped apartment brought a victory that turned into a velvet noose. My stomach didn't just churn from hunger. It was the miracle I never asked for. I reached for my phone, not to check the time, but to see the notification that made my heart stop. A single message from a number with no caller ID, sent from a mirrored high-end world I thought I'd left behind. I don't know where you are yet, Soraya, but I have already cataloged every exit you took. You and the baby are mine. You've just stepped into the heart of Seoul. We believe every fortune has a story, and every story has a hidden side. Subscribe to keep your seat at the table. You won't want to miss what we're revealing next week. I stared at the heavy iron door of the penthouse through blurred, tear-stricken eyes, my lungs burning with the kind of desperation only sheer terror can give you. The memory of the night was a visceral, jagged thing, a heated night of charged intimacy that had begun with the magnetic pull of Park Jun-sok's intense, dark eyes, and ended in the raw, explosive violence of his true world. I had seen him not as the composed CEO the public admired, but as the cold mafia boss, a man of absolute authority whose hands could shift from a gentle caress to a lethal strike in a heartbeat. That realization had struck me with a paralyzing fear, a bone-deep certainty that staying meant being swallowed by the underworld's reach. June Suk, I'm gone. I didn't say it aloud. I didn't have to. I just ran. I fled past the silent, stone-faced guards who stood like sentinels of a gilded cage and into the rain-slicked streets of Seoul. The city, usually a vibrant explosion of light, had transformed into a shadow-filled maze, a labyrinth of neon and grit, where every luxury vehicle felt like a predator and every dark suit felt like a shadow of the man I was leaving behind. My fingers flew across the keyboard of my burner phone as I hailed a taxi to the train station, my mind racing faster than the vehicle. I had spent years building a career based on dignified presence and strategic discipline, but none of it mattered now. All that mattered was distance. I hit the lock on my phone with a triumphant, shaking jab of my thumb, feeling like I had finally escaped the mirrored high-end trap. As the train pulled away from the station, I leaned my head against the cold glass, my breath hitching in a quiet, resigned sigh. I was a poised woman, or at least I used to be, but now I was a ghost. I was fleeing into the thick fog of the unknown, leaving behind a man who didn't believe in ghosts, a man who believed in the absolute authority of finding what was his. I didn't know then that the night had left me with more than just a memory. It had left me with a life-changing secret that would eventually lead Jeon-suk to order a global, calculated search. For now, I was just a woman in flight, disappearing into the dark, unaware that the shadow of the mafia boss was already beginning to stretch across the miles to find me. 6 weeks of hiding in shadows had transformed my life into a series of calculated silences. Busan was a coastal sanctuary of salt air and rhythmic tides, far removed from the sterile, mirrored, high-end world of Seoul. I had traded my fitted business suits for oversized sweaters and a quiet, anonymous existence in a cramped apartment overlooking the docks. Here, I was just another face in the crowd, a poised woman who had become a ghost to survive. I spent my days watching the news with a hollow chest, waiting for the calculated search or the underworld's reach to finally crash through my door. But it wasn't the mafia that found me first. It was my own body. The victory of my escape began to turn into a velvet noose as the morning sunlight stabbed through my thin curtains. I didn't just wake up with the weariness of a woman in flight. I woke up with a nausea that felt like a physical weight, a churning sea in my gut that had nothing to do with the smell of the fish markets below. I sat on the edge of the bed, one hand resting protectively on my belly, feeling the first stirrings of a miracle I had never asked for. The realization was a paralyzing fear that hit harder than any threat Jeon-seok had ever leveled. I was carrying the child of a man who believed in absolute authority, a man who viewed people as assets or liabilities. This wasn't just my secret anymore. It was a life-changing consequence that anchored me to him more firmly than any legal contract or iron door ever could. As I looked out at the fog rolling off the Han River, I realized that my self-reliance was a fragile bubble of hope. I was no longer just a woman protecting her own life. I was a sanctuary for another. Every dizzy spell and every wave of exhaustion felt like a digital trail I was leaving behind, a biological breadcrumb that his analytical intensity would eventually find. I walked to the small bathroom, my reflection showing a woman who was poised but burdened, her eyes reflecting the heavy cost of a single night of charged intimacy. I had fled to Busan to be free, but as I touched my stomach, I knew the possessive cage was already closing in. I was no longer running alone, and in the world of Park Jeon-seok, being vulnerable was the most dangerous thing a person could be. In the cold, clinical heart of his obsidian-clad office, Park Jun-seok stood as a monolith of practiced stillness. For weeks, the silence of the penthouse had been a weapon he turned inward, a strategic duel against the well-lit fog that had swallowed Zariah Coleman. He didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in the absolute authority of data and the underworld's reach that could peel back the layers of any city. His expression remained serious and unreadable, his serious eyes fixed on the array of monitors that reflected a calculated investigation in progress. To Jun-seok, Zariah's disappearance was not just a personal insult, it was a mirrored, high-end trap she had somehow managed to breach. He ran his empire with analytical intensity, treating human connection like a strategic duel where he always held the king. He watched as his lead associate, a man of guarded stance and lethal readiness, filtered through thousands of hours of grainy security footage and digital trails that led to nowhere. Jun-seok knew that even the most poised and burdened fugitive eventually made a microscopic slip. The breakthrough didn't come from a flash of violence or a raw, explosive confrontation. It was a single fragment of evidence, a discreet gesture captured by a transaction at a small pharmacy in Busan, a purchase of prenatal vitamins. The composed detachment Jun-seok usually maintained shattered, replaced by a fierce, primal need that burned with resolute fire. The miracle he hadn't known of was now a valuable asset he was destined to reclaim. He picked up his phone, his voice a low, smooth baritone that commanded the space. "Target located," he murmured, the words carrying the terminal pressure of a man who had finally found the thread he needed to pull. He looked at the radiant but burdened face of Zariah on his screen, noting the quiet strength in her eyes that even the digital grain couldn't hide. She was no longer just a woman who had fled a heated night. She was the mother of his heir, a part of his fortress of success that he would never allow to remain in exile. As he gestured for his team to move, the rhythmic thud of leather soles against the marble signaled the end of her coastal sanctuary. The calculated search was over. The possession was about to begin. The rhythmic thud of leather soles against the worn wooden floor of the hallway was a sound I had heard in my nightmares for months. I stood frozen in the center of my small Busan kitchen, a half-peeled orange in my hand, as the silence of my coastal sanctuary was systematically dismantled. There was no explosive violence, no splintering of wood. Instead, the door opened with the clinical precision of a man who owned the very air I breathed. Park Jun-sok stepped into the room, a monolith of practiced stillness and a short black suit that made the cramped apartment feel like a cardboard box. His expression was serious, controlled, and utterly unreadable, his intense dark eyes sweeping over the space until they landed on me. The air in the room seemed to vanish, replaced by the terminal pressure of his presence. I felt my hand instinctively move to my belly, a protectiveness that signaled my vulnerability even as I tried to maintain a dignified presence. My fragile bubble of hope, the one I had painstakingly built over 6 weeks of hiding, didn't just pop, it evaporated under his focused gaze. "You've led me on quite a strategic duel, Zariah," he said, his voice a low, smooth baritone that resonated with absolute authority. He didn't move toward me, yet I felt the underworld's reach closing around my throat. "You and the baby," he said, his voice a low, smooth baritone that sounded like a promise and a sentence, "are mine." The return to Seoul was a journey through a mirrored high-end trap, a blur of tinted windows and the silent, lethal readiness of Jun-sok's security detail. I found myself standing in the center of his penthouse, a space defined by minimalist luxury that felt more like a clinical vacuum than a home. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city's vibrant explosion of light, but inside, the atmosphere was one of suffocating suspense. Every piece of bespoke furniture and every shadow-filled corner whispered of his absolute authority. This was a possessive cage, curated with the same analytical intensity Jun-sok applied to his global empire, and I was its newest, most valuable asset. Jun-sok moved through the hushed elegance of the suite with a fluid grace that commanded the space, his mask of serene indifference firmly back in place. He watched me with an intense, watchful gaze, noting the way my hand remained protectively anchored to my belly. The power imbalance in the room was palpable. I was a poised but burdened guest in a fortress of success, where even the silence was a constructed thing. I looked at the sleek obsidian surfaces and the sterile white walls, realizing that my coastal sanctuary had been traded for a prison of gold and glass. "This is your home now, Zariah," he said, his voice a low, smooth baritone that broke no strategic duel. "Everything you need, everything the baby needs, is within these walls." He approached me, his proximity creating a terminal pressure that made it difficult to breathe. He didn't touch me, but the underworld's reach was evident in the way his trusted associates stood like sentinels at the perimeter of the room. I felt a quiet, resigned sigh escape my lips as I met his unreadable stare. I was no longer a ghost running through the fog. I was a centerpiece in his mirrored world. As the door clicked shut with a sound of heavy finality, I realized that the calculated search had ended only to begin a new kind of war. Jun-suk wanted possession, but I still possessed my secrets and my quiet strength. I looked out at the city skyline, a radiant but distant dream, and felt the fierce, primal need to survive this gilded imprisonment. I was trapped in his minimalist luxury, but as I felt the soft stirrings of the miracle within me, I knew that the battle for our autonomy had only just moved to a more beautiful, more dangerous battlefield. The clinical silence of the penthouse was shattered, not by a sound, but by the cold, analytical intensity of the glowing monitors in Jun-suk's private study. I stood near the obsidian desk, my hand resting protectively on my belly, watching as the man who claimed absolute authority over my life transformed. His mask of serene indifference didn't just crack, it hardened into a lethal readiness that made the air in the room feel heavy with terminal pressure. He was reviewing a digital trail of encrypted communications, a fragment of evidence that suggested his fortress of success was compromised from within. A traitor in his own organization had been leaking my location long before Jun-suk found me, not to help me escape, but to orchestrate a moment where I could be used as a target to hurt him. The revelation was a jagged piece of truth in our high-tension game of shadows. Jun-suk's trusted associate stood in the corner, his guarded stance more rigid than usual, his eyes scanning the data for the microscopic slip that would reveal the mole. I felt a wave of paralyzing fear, not of the man beside me, but of the invisible enemies lurking in the underworld's reach, waiting for the right moment to strike at my vulnerability. "They thought they could use you as a liability," Jun-suk murmured, his voice a low, smooth baritone that vibrated with a fierce, primal need to protect. He didn't look at me, but his hand clenched into a white-knuckled fist atop the desk. "They don't realize that you are the only thing in this world I will not negotiate for." He turned to me then, his intense dark eyes searching mine with an unfeigned seriousness. For the first time, I didn't see the cold mafia boss or the distant CEO. I saw a man who was genuinely rattled by the threat to his miracle. The power imbalance shifted as he leaned in, his proximity no longer a possessive cage, but a resolute shield. The digital trail of betrayal had turned his minimalist luxury into a battlefield, and I was no longer just an asset he had reclaimed. I was the center of a war he was determined to win at any cost. As he barked a series of commands into his phone, his absolute authority was no longer about owning me. It was about ensuring that the shadow-filled maze of his world never touched the woman who had breached his emotional walls. The clinical stillness of the penthouse was shattered by a sharp, suffocating suspense that had nothing to do with the underworld's reach and everything to do with the fragile miracle Zoraya carried. It began as a dull ache, a quiet, resigned sigh of pain that rapidly escalated into a terminal pressure. Zoraya collapsed against the obsidian kitchen island, her hand anchored protectively to her belly as her poised and burdened composure finally broke. The rhythmic thud of leather soles against the marble floor signaled Jun-suk's approach, but this time the sound was frantic, devoid of its usual absolute authority. When he reached her, the mask of serene indifference he had worn for years didn't just crack, it fell away entirely. For a man who operated with analytical intensity and composed detachment, the sight of Zoraya's pallor and her labored breathing triggered a raw, explosive panic he was unprepared for. He dropped to his knees beside her, his sharp eyes searching hers with unfeigned seriousness. As he gathered her into his arms, his movements were no longer those of a cold mafia boss claiming a valuable asset, but of a man desperately afraid of losing the only thing that had breached his fortress of success. The drive to the private clinic was a blurred maze of neon and grit, but Jun-suk's focus was singular. In the back of the luxury vehicle, he held her hand with a fierce, primal need, his proximity shifting from a possessive cage to a desperate sanctuary. When the doctors finally took her behind the heavy iron doors of the emergency wing, Jun-suk was forced to wait. He stood in the sterile hallway, a monolith of practiced stillness, now trembling with an unfamiliar vulnerability. When the lead physician emerged to tell him that Zoraya and the baby were stable, Jun-suk experienced a moment of genuine, unfeigned relief at the depth of his own relief. It was a profound and aching revelation. His capacity for care had outgrown his desire for control. He realized that his obsessive intensity was no longer about owning a woman who had fled, but about a miracle he was terrifyingly unprepared to live without. As he finally stepped into her quiet room, his resolute fire was replaced by a quiet presence. He didn't speak of possession or debts. He simply sat by her side, learning for the first time that true strength is found in the gentleness of a shared life. The clinical quiet of the penthouse was shattered not by a sound, but by the sudden, violent death of the city lights outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. A shadow-filled maze swallowed the minimalist luxury as the backup generators kicked in with a low, mechanical growl. Park Jun-suk stood in the center of the living room, his posture shifting instantly into a state of lethal readiness. The calculated investigation he had been running into the traitor was over. The enemy was no longer a digital trail, but a physical force at his doorstep. "Zariah, get to the safe room, now," he commanded, his voice a low, smooth baritone that vibrated with an absolute authority that broke no strategic duel. Zariah didn't hesitate, her hand anchored protectively to her belly as she moved with a quiet strength that defied the paralyzing fear clawing at her chest. She saw the flash of suppressed rage in Jun-suk's eyes as his trusted associate drew a weapon, his guarded stance now a terminal promise of violence. A coordinated attack from rival syndicates was crashing against his fortress of success, a raw and explosive attempt to liquidate his empire by targeting his most valuable asset. The heavy iron doors of the safe room clicked shut, but through the monitors, Zariah watched the man who had claimed her as his property transform into a secret guardian. Jun-suk moved with a fluid grace through the darkened suite, his mask of serene indifference replaced by a resolute fire. He was no longer the CEO managing a corporate merger. He was a monolith of practiced stillness engaging in a lethal dance of self-preservation. Every movement was an exercise in analytical intensity, designed to shield the miracle he had discovered in Busan from the underworld's reach. Gunfire erupted, a vibrant and chaotic explosion that lit up the penthouse in jagged strobes. Jun-suk didn't fight like a man protecting an investment. He fought like a man protecting his soul. The power imbalance of their relationship felt distant as she watched him risk everything to maintain the sanctuary he had built for them. In that moment of terminal pressure, the empire was in flames, but the cold Mafia Boss had finally found a cause more potent than power. As the last of the intruders fell to his clinical precision, Jun-suk stood amidst the wreckage, his chest heaving, his intense dark eyes fixed on the door where Zariah waited, proving that even in the heart of a war, his only focus was the family he refused to lose. The smoke from the empire's flames eventually cleared, leaving behind a resolute clarity that Park Jun-suk had never known in his years of absolute authority. Standing amidst the scorched, minimalist luxury of his penthouse, he looked at Zariah, poised, burdened no longer, but radiant with a quiet strength that had finally breached his fortress of success. The life-changing consequences of their heated night had evolved into a miracle that demanded a future free from the underworld's reach. With a discreet gesture that signaled the end of a strategic duel with his own past, Jun-suk began the clinical process of liquidating his criminal history. He didn't just step away, he dismantled the shadow-filled maze piece by painstaking piece. Assets were stripped, alliances were severed with lethal readiness, and the immense control he once craved was traded for a far country where his name held no weight. This was his final, most calculated investigation, finding a sanctuary where the terminal pressure of the mafia could never reach the woman he loved or the child she carried. He was no longer a monolith of practiced stillness protecting an empire. He was a secret guardian preparing a home. Months later, the air was different, thick with the scent of salt spray and the unforced grace of a life lived in the sun. In a quiet villa far from the mirrored high-end traps of Seoul, Junsok watched Zaraya walk along the shore, her hand still resting protectively on her belly, though now the gesture was one of peace rather than paralyzing fear. He joined her, his leather soles replaced by the soft grit of the sand, his mask of serene indifference gone, replaced by a genuine, unfeigned warmth. "I spent my life building walls to keep people out," he murmured, his voice a low baritone that blended with the rhythmic tides. "I never realized that true strength is found in the gentleness of being seen." Zaraya looked at him, her eyes reflecting a dignified presence that had conquered the coldness of a mafia boss. They were no longer a strategic pairing or a debt to be paid. They were a partnership born of shared solitude and a resolute choice to be better. As the sun set over their new world, Junsok felt a profound and aching gratitude. He had traded an empire for a quiet presence, realizing that while he once wanted to own her, he was now simply, terrifyingly, and happily hers. Some stories end. Others follow you home. If this one did, subscribe. There's more waiting.